Okay. Good afternoon, if you can hear me. If you can't, so be it. We're going to continue on. You've heard of dinner and a show. This is lunch and a show. So we're going to work our way through this pork carcass as you're eating pork. My name is Ryan Cox. I'm with the University of Minnesota. I'm the extension meat specialist there. Joining me is Dallas Dornink, our meat lab supervisor, as well as Dr. Jerry Kennan from Hormel Foods. We're going to walk our way through this side of pork. We've been asked to sort of think about how we market this pork, and so that's what we're doing. This is a common format for us. If you've not seen us work before, please come see us on the St. Paul campus. So, starting off, we're going to work our way, generally speaking, in a pork carcass, in particular, any four-legged animal, we know generally, and you know generally, that fat is going to be deposited from the front of the animal back, number one. Number two, we're going to have a redder meat towards the front of the carcass because we're closer to the heart. And so generally, if you think about, say, in beef, a beef chuck roast that has that really heavy laced fat in it, okay, that's because it's further forward. Same is true of the pork shoulder as opposed to the fresh ham. The fresh ham back here is going to be a lighter color. It's going to have a different type of fiber. Again, proximity to the heart. And so when you start to see these separations made, these separations are made entirely based on tenderness. The three primary flavor attributes of meat that Jerry would, and we all evaluate, are flavor, juiciness, and tenderness. But this is essentially separated on tenderness because muscles that get used more are going to be tougher. Muscles that get used less are going to be more tender. This is where we get the phrase living high on the hog. If you could afford to buy stuff that was higher on the hog, it's more tender. Okay, and so as we move further away, we know that things are getting used more. Muscles of locomotion, they have more collagen, that protein collagen, structural protein. Most abundant protein in any mammal's body, but it's a problem when we go to consuming this. And so the structure is fantastic, but we know now this is a food product. This pig did not care about us eating food. Okay, so it needed to function as an animal first, and so we have to work around that. And so I'm going to talk, and Dallas is going to kind of work our way. You can see the first cut is made here and separating sort of this large map of meat. Here, when you're taking the front shoulder off, this is made between the second and the third rib. Okay, and that's by specification, meaning that if we were to cut it longer, we're adding weight here, or if we cut it shorter, we're adding weight to the loin, which we know has a higher value. So that's why the specification exists. So that's done the same every time, between second and third, or 1.5 and third, because there's such a heavy curve to that rib. Jerry, did you have items to add on that? There you go.
It's on now, right? Hi, everybody. So we go, Hormel, we go right in the middle of the second rib.
Right in the middle of the second rib.
1.5 ribs, and it's really so that you can get good, consistent ribs. So ribs are a high-value item, both loin back ribs off the loin and then the spare ribs. And so that first rib, is very good for protection and what it does for the pig, but when somebody's trying to gnaw on that for supper, it takes a lot of work.
And so as you can see, some of the guide marks have been cut already. So if this is coming out, this is the neck bone. And so you can see this neck bone, this is the backbone, the neck that goes up to the head going this direction. So this is the jowl from the head, okay? And so the second and third rib is where the cut is made. So you have 1 and 2 here, okay? So you've got 2 ribs here. These, if you've had country-style ribs, these are country-style ribs. And so we take these long ribs here with the associated flesh, okay, and so we would put more lean on here, and that would be your country-style rib. If we don't do that and the rib comes off, then we can fabricate this as a Boston shoulder. Another thing that's coming away from the shoulder is the jowl. This is something that it's coming from the lower side of the head, obviously, as it runs up to the tip of the jaw, okay. As you can see, it does have some glands in it and some associated fat, connective tissue, but there is still some lean here. And this is a pretty good yield for lean. And Jerry, you might talk a little bit about, the destiny or the destination for this type of lean, as opposed to, say, the back.
So what we do with this is a couple things. For one, we actually send that to Mexico to go into chorizo. They're making a Mexican sausage. But then we will also use it for our different sausage items, our dry sausages that we'll make, and it's a good combination of fat and lean for our products.
And speaking of dry sausages, and dry curing is also becoming more popular online on shows. When we dry cure this portion here, this would be the John Collie or the jowl bacon. This would be that portion that comes from a little bit stronger pork flavor, that has those glands in it. So again, that's removed, again, from the shoulder. And so you've got the top portion of the shoulder, the Boston shoulder, the blade Boston. Okay, this is the higher yielding portion of the shoulder. This is where the scapula and the arm bone are going to interact. Okay, if you can imagine or remember, the scapula or the blade bone is sitting in muscle and not connected by bone to the rest of the carcass. And so the muscles that are around that scapula have to hold up the weight of the front of the animal. And that's why those muscles are so coarse. And that also gives us a guide for our knife. So we know that now that we've taken that neck bone out, the only bone in there is that blade bone and a small portion of the arm bone perhaps. So that's what we'll do. We'll fabricate that portion first. So we'll take the top of the shoulder. He's going to take the blade bone out. Put this down a little bit. The blade bone comes out again. It's floating. It's the angel's wing, if you can imagine, the flat bone that the arm bone connects into, the ball and socket. So it's like a paddle. It's got a ridge on it. And so he's got to work his way around the ridge. And on the other side of the blade, there's a small portion of the blade bone that's also going to be in the loin because it is cut between the second and the third rib. In the beef carcass, the muscles that sit on top of that blade bone, the one that's being marketed very heavily now is the flat iron. That's the infraspinatus muscle. The pig has an infraspinatus muscle as well, but the flat iron steak would be tiny, minuscule. So it would go on a skewer maybe. But again, this is the blade bone coming out. It's got this ridge on it here, and that's where all the muscles are holding on to and doing all the work of the front of the carcass. Sure, you have anything?
So just what we do with the butt. So what we do with the butt, and has anybody heard of the term Boston butt? You can't hear me?
CT butt.
Is there volume on this?
Get it closer.
Like this? All right. I'm like an auctioneer now. No, so this is the Boston butt. Anybody out there know why it's called the Boston butt? Anybody want to guess? Close, yes. Butchers in Boston. Do you know when Butchers in Boston?
1777.
Yes. Why? Where did they put them? They took the pork shoulder, put them in cask called butts. Thus, the Boston butt.
Yep.
All right? Good trivia. So when you're the phone a friend, you can know that answer. So what do we do with it today? That goes in two things. That goes into pulled pork. Barbecues, smoked pulled pork, huge industry. That's going to be what the majority of that goes. Also, in the South, they'll actually cut these into steaks called shoulder steaks everywhere except in St. Louis. St. Louis, they're called butt steaks.
Absolutely. So what we'll commonly do in our lab then is we'll move a little further and give you a sense of so we've got the entire boneless shoulder here, the boneless butt, the Boston butt. We're going to take off what we call the collar, which is that muscle grouping that is the back muscle. Okay, so you've got this back muscle traveling up, and we've arbitrarily put a knife here. That animal did not care, so those muscles continue up. Very much like ribeyes continue up into a chuck at a beef carcass. Okay, we know that those chuck steaks are also very good. These muscle groupings are very tender. If you're in the barbecue world and you watch a lot of those shows when we're talking about money muscle, this is the money muscle. This is the more tender part that's going to be sliced pork in barbecue. Or in dry curing, this is where we're going to come in and start dry curing this and making capa, capicola, things of that nature. And so again, a lot more fat laced in there. It looks a little bit more like a pork chop as opposed to a butt or a shoulder because you can see the eye. Okay, and that eye gets smaller as you can see, but that eye gets smaller and smaller in the collar. This is the hump up on the shoulder you see on the pig. Okay, that's Jowl, slicing Jowl, the money muscle and barbecue. And then you've got the boneless steaks could be cut from there, but we're going to leave it as a single piece roast I think is most appropriate for this use. Anything to add on the front end? Okay. So we're going to move down. We're moving down from the Boston shoulder. Again, we've made a cut now. There's a cut made between where the arm bone and the blade bone meet. Okay, we don't want to add too much weight to this this picnic, or the Boston rather, because it has more weight, the top part. So that's why it has to be at that joint. Dallas is removing some skin and then is going to find our seam. The seam essentially is where the pectoralis muscles are sitting. Okay, so the pecs in a beef carcass would be brisket. A much smaller muscle grouping here in a pork carcass, so that's going to come off. Perhaps go to trim or elsewhere. And then we've got the cushion or the meaty portion, which is the back of the picnic shoulder, which can yield for lots of other value-added items. Further south, the picnic shoulder can just be a barbecue or a pulled pork item. Could leave the entire shoulder intact for pulled pork, commonly. You're going to get a little more connective tissue, a little bit more gelatin in this portion of the carcass, which some do associate with pulled pork. So, again, there's some regionality, I'd say, to that. But here we're going to bone it out like we do here in Minnesota. We're going to go ahead and bone it out and get it pulled apart. So we're going to take off that pectoralis grouping and then that cushion.
So does anybody...
It's got a lag. Let's have it.
Try this again. Works now, right?
Yeah.
So, regionality. In the state of Minnesota, what's the pork shoulder used for? Spam. Spam.
I wasn't allowed to say it, but he can say it.
You can say it.
That's where it's coming from.
That's the meat material for spam.
Right there. So you've got essentially a trim grouping here. You can see this is associated with the stick. We've got some different directionality to the muscles. So this is commonly going to go to the grinder or a restructured product. The more intact muscle, again, going to rework that into a higher quality. And when we say value added, we're taking water, salt, sugar, nitrate commonly, putting those back together, cooking them. They adhere to each other, and we can create that. We'll obviously talk a good bit more about that back here in the ham. So then you've got the trimmed picnic shoulder. You can see it's still got the butt portion on it or the back portion on it, the meatier, higher yielding portion. And so this would be the picnic butt for barbecuing, if you will. Closer to a family of four pulled pork type of yield. Any questions, thoughts there? Skin off on that. So we're going to move our way back now. Again, remembering that between the second and third rib is where we made that cut. We've got the top portion here, the loin, and the bottom portion, the belly, all together is the trunk. This cut is made, okay, so a cut is made along the belly, immediately under the tenderloin. We want to leave this tenderloin muscle right here in the carcass. Okay, it's the most tender muscle in the carcass, the tenderloin. So that cut's made immediately under that and goes right up to where essentially we meet up and leave just a small amount of rib there. And so this long cut gives us this portion here. So we'll pull those apart a little bit. And we can see the loin pulls away, and then the skin can be pulled from the loin to leave us the belly. Because the belly is such a scrutinized, very valuable portion of the carcass now, we want to make sure that the belly yields as much as possible because of our demand for bacon, obviously. And so you can see that here in more traditional cutting with a knife. You won't see this scribe line quite like this. Automated equipment is able to pull this off like this, but it's the same thing we're doing is we're separating very high value from what at some point, especially in this area, we're grinding up, and then as we sort of became obsessed with bacon, the demand went up. First piece off of that, we'll work with the spare rib, I suppose, first. The spare rib is being spared from the belly. So it's spare to the belly. It's secondary to the belly. It's that muscle grouping there, so it's coming off of the face of the belly, making sure we're not robbing too much lean out of the belly. If you're running a rib business, you're going to rob lean from the belly. If you're running a belly business, you're robbing from the ribs. He's removing the diaphragm. Okay, in a beef carcass, we'd call that a skirt steak. In a pork carcass, we call this trim because it's so small. But you can see it has lots of connective tissue associated with it. So if you are going to use it, all of this connective tissue that was associated with breathing every single breath, that's toughness. Okay, so that would come out. This would be anchored to a muscle that in a beef carcass would be called a hanger steak. But again, that muscle grouping is very small in a pork carcass. It's not commonly marketed. So he's got the diaphragm off. The next thing he's going to do is he's going to remove the sternum, essentially where the ribs come together. So if you can imagine here where your ribs come together, there's cartilage there that allows some flexibility in your rib cage. Same with the pig. And so we can take advantage of that cartilage, and he can use his knife to get through those cartilage caps. Because if you cook these ribs like they are, you can't run a knife between every rib, right? And so if he takes that cartilage plate off, that sternum off, this here, and you can actually see the white buttons, that's cartilage buttons where he ran his knife through, then you're left with the St. Louis style spare rib.
Famous Dave's.
Yep.
Famous Dave's.
Yep.
St. Louis style rib.
Also the rib tips or riblets, if you're talking about value-added item here, you've got a lot of lean here. And if you see a restaurant putting these on special, running these, it's because they've bought in and they've trimmed down. So you've got an opportunity here for rib tips, and you can see we essentially would just break these between the pieces of cartilage. And these smoke right along next to the ribs in the smoker. So something not to neglect. Again, we've got to use every part of the carcass. The next thing we need to be mindful of in these spare ribs is the membrane.
You'll see a lot of the rib tips. Those will be appetizers at the local golf course or sports bar. They'll cut those, and then they'll fry those or bake those, put them with buffalo sauce, some type of barbecue sauce, and there you go. You'll have your appetizer for the big game.
Something smaller processors do, packers don't do just as a practice, is to remove this membrane from the belly, from the ribs. If you're out there cooking ribs with that membrane on, I encourage you to take it off. All that is a sheet of collagen. And so it eats like paper. When you bite into a spare rib and you have to pull it off a piece of paper, it's that membrane right there. So you want to make sure you get that membrane pulled off the inside of those ribs before they go to seasoning, brining, cooking, etc. Really nice set of ribs looking there. And so when that's done, we've taken off all those things we can't get our teeth through. We're left with this big flap of meat. Okay, and I think it's obvious where we go with this. As a fresh side, it's fresh belly side. We can come in with salt. It would be salted pork. It is only when this piece of meat is smoked that we call it bacon. Really important that this is not bacon right now. This is fresh pork side. And essentially it's pork trim holding hands until we start making bacon. Okay, so this is the yield on the belly. Pretty standard sized belly. This pig would be somewhere live between 300 and 280 pounds, as you'd imagine. So that's very typical for about a 100-pound side. This is going to get the cure. We know that we're going to go water, salt, sugar nitrite. It's going to be injected, tumbled, and then it's going to be hung and smoked before it's chilled and sliced. Any thoughts on the belly?
Yeah, so distiller's grain, DDGs, feeding that because it's good from an economic standpoint, feeding DDGs to the pigs. What happens is the fat here in the bacon will be more unsaturated because of the fat going into the pig. And as it becomes more unsaturated, it becomes harder to process because it becomes softer. And you set up your belly presses, your slicers are set up to cut a consistently firm, cut going through. And as it isn't as firm, because now the melting point's a lot lower, the belly fat's actually having some melting, then that's where you see the off pieces. And you'll see maybe in your bacon package it'll look like an S, or it won't. It looks like maybe one side was cut thick, the other side it kind of went to a point. And that's some of the issues with workmanship, that could be related back to the diet of the pig.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So was that it? Okay, yep, so again, high-speed slicers is a real reason we like the firm fat. As you can see, this fat has been sitting here for a while and it's soft. If you run this through a high-speed slicer, you're going to get what Jerry just said. It's going to be fat on one end and thin on the other because it's pushing it all the way up against the wall when it's slicing it. So that's why meats people actually care about the fat. It seems like a strange thing at the end of the day, but it really is important, especially from a shelf life perspective as well. A less saturated fat is going to oxidize quicker. So lots to consider there. We're going to roll now into the loin. The loin's going to take a little work, so I'm just going to let Dallas run with it for a minute. But the loin is running from, again, you've got between the second and third rib is where that cut is made, all the way back here, okay, and so you're immediately in front of the hip bone. Okay, that's about an inch in front of the hip bone. Meat cutters call this the H-bone. It's just our own slang. Okay, but this H-bone kind of is a guide point. So an inch in front of that. This cut is made perpendicular to the length of this shank. So that's why it can stand usually straight up. Okay, so it's cut correctly. Yeah, so meat people stand hams up all the time to see if they're cut correctly. It's just a fun little habit. So that cut is made there, and so now we've got two main muscles. You've got the top loin muscle and the tenderloin muscle. The top loin muscle sits along the top of the backbone, and then under the backbone and inside the body cavity, getting up near the hips, is the tenderloin. And so that muscle is doing virtually no work. Remember we said the more work a muscle does, the tougher it gets, the more collagen it has. This muscle sits on the inside of the carcass. It's got bone around it because of the backbone, and it's covered in a whole lot of fat. So it does very little work. Okay, that's why it's so tender. The trade-off is that it's not terribly marbled. and it's true of most carcasses species as well, is it's not terribly marbled. So you've got a tender cut with a little less marbling. So again, variety, another type of variety coming from the carcass. You'll see these commonly packaged together where the head and the tail are put together sort of back and forth. Thoughts on
You'll
that?
see a lot of these will go into seasoned meats, and it is because there's not the same amount of marbling. So if you just cook that without any seasoning or rub, it would be fairly bland. So teriyaki, apple bourbon, Italian, different types of seasonings, you'll see those, they're using the tenderloin there for those products.
Also referred to sometimes as the catfish muscle because it looks like a fish. Okay, so now the next cut that's been made, Dallas has come in and he's taken off the sirloin portion of the loin. So as you go back on the animal, you know that the muscle has to come up to go up over the hip bone. Anytime a muscle has to take a turn and get irregular in shape, it gets a little tougher. And so sirloin is just slightly tougher than regular loin, slightly leaner because it's further back in the carcass. And so it's a nice economical portion of the carcass. It's a little leaner, so if you're looking for leaner pulled pork, commonly can come from this sirloin section. Obviously your sirloin chops would come from this section. We're going boneless for this demonstration. We could put this portion on the bandsaw and cut some bone-in sirloin chops, but we're going boneless here so you can see the portion of the hip bone. This is the hip bone that it came off of, so you can see where it turns up for the tail. Okay, so the muscle has to negotiate this, and that's why the muscle itself becomes a little flatter and a little more regularly shaped than a pork chop that would be bunched up and more round. And so the rounder the muscle, the more tender it will be as well. And so that would be your sirloin roast that then goes into sirloin chops. If we can maybe grab a...
So the sirloin chops will be, you'll see these, will be the family variety packs. And it's not that there's a variety of different cuts, it's how much the muscle changes in that area gives a look of, yeah, there is some variety there.
Yep. That one looks good right there. Yep, so your sirloin chops are going to have the two muscle groupings. As you get back further, you're picking up the leg muscles, essentially, the rump muscles, the gluteus muscles that become part of that chop. It's a larger chop. So again, if you like larger yielding versus more marbling versus tenderness, again, you've got variety here along the back. All right, you can just pull it. Next step we're going to do is essentially we're going to take the top loin muscle off of the bone structure. And so when you do that, you're rolling out a muscle. You're leaving some very short ribs sitting on the backbone, okay? They're short and they got referred to as baby ribs because they're so small, and they're running along the back. So they're baby back ribs. That's exactly how it gets its name, very simple. So what he's doing is he's exposing the baby back ribs by pulling off the top loin muscle, the longissimus dorsi. Important to note, in automation, a lot of this can be done either on the belt or on the rail.
So this is, there isn't a lot of automation. There's a lot of automation. Like when we pulled the loins earlier, you're using automated saws. This is still very manual here. And it's on, so it's on a line, but at the same time, you have a dozen people using knives as it goes past, so very labor intensive.
You're looking at laser guide lines, essentially, so employees are turning it on the belt to get it to the second and third rib or an inch in front. And so again, with that repetition comes a lot of accuracy and really good yields, really, making each cut a single person. Let me grab it real quick. So what he's got is a large muscling that is free almost of bone. We've got a piece of blade bone sitting in here. But you can see this is still not the boneless loin that you pick up when you go to the wholesale store because it's got all the secondary muscles on it. If you're cutting a bone-in pork chop, these secondary muscles will get left on it. And so when you're cutting bone in, you're not only selling the weight of the bone, but also the secondary muscles that are there. When you're going boneless, we tend to just isolate out the LD, which is what we're going to do here. Rolling it out, it's almost in a channel, and it's got all those secondary muscles sitting around that. A lot of this work can actually be done with your thumb because there is such a large seam, especially with fatted pigs that have a good seam on them. Then it makes it a lot easier to fabricate. Secondary muscles go to trim and grind.
Yeah, secondary muscles, when you're going through this, is going to go to trim. So it's going to go to sausage. It's going to go to pepperoni. In our establishment, a lot of dry sausage type products. Just give you an idea, 75% of the loins, so 19,000 pigs a day in Austin, so that's 38,000 loins, 75% of those would go through the boning process.
Like this. So when you're talking about removing those secondary muscles that were part of a bone-in pork chop and saying what is the difference between a bone-in and a boneless pork chop, there's more than just the bone. This is a lot of yield. And so as we go from bone-in to boneless, regardless of what the cuts are, we have to consider all the other portions that are going to a value-added product, essentially. And there would be your Price Club style boneless pork loin with secondary muscles removed, still a small portion of the tail on. This is essentially chop ready. We're not going to go to trimming a whole lot more fat, even though there is a small amount of fat here that was part of that seam. This is the fat that remains. Not like in a beef carcass where we go and continue to peel off more fat because there generally is. So, yeah.
Typically your retail, the specification for trim at retail is down to 1/8 of an inch of trim.
Yep.
And basically with that, you can see what they call the blue. You're not trimming into it, but you're trimming it down where you can see what they call the blue, which is the lean underneath the fat.
So we're starting in at the blade. And so at the blade, you have a lot of the secondary muscles that came from that shoulder. So you can see all those secondary muscles that have the seam in them. Darker colors, like we said, we're closer to the heart. Looks a lot more like a ribeye steak, okay, as opposed to a center cut loin chop. Or even further back when you've got the isolated single top loin muscle. This is a center loin chop or a rib chop. Okay, when it has the curvature of the rib, that'd be the rib chop. Very round in the rib portion. As you move your way back, you get flatter and flatter. As you can see, you get closer to the sirloin. So in the true center chop, you're getting a lot closer to the shape of the sirloin. And then you make your way back. Where did our sirloin go? Just as the reminder. Yep, so you can see just as the reminder, as you go further and further back, it just gets longer and longer and more irregularly shaped, which tells me we're giving away a little bit of tenderness, but not really, as long as we're still part of the top loin. Okay, maybe do a double butterfly. As a demonstration, this is the butterfly chop, so he's going to cut almost all the way down to the table, leave it, and then cut another chop. So what in the world would we do? Why do we cut butterfly chops? You'll see it more at retail, you'll see it more in restaurant. You're not going to see it coming a lot from packers because everybody has a recipe for sauce and dry rub, and this is just more surface area for that, okay? That's why we butterfly most things, is more surface area for more seasoning. Commonly, we'll also butterfly to get the cut thinner because it might be too tough. Not very common with pork, though. Pork is a young animal. Pork chops don't need it to be cut thinner to get over the toughness. So when you butterfly the chop, it's mainly to pick up flavors. You can go. Yep.
Nowadays, you'll have them, they'll butterfly it and then stuff it with some sage or seasonings or dressings. So
absolutely,
it's very popular now.
Very popular. Okay, we'll move our way to the fresh ham. We call this the fresh ham or a green ham, meaning nothing's been done to it, or more importantly, it's not received any sort of cure. He's going to come in and remove the skin first, just as a demonstration, because it's easier to see the muscle groupings that we're talking about. So he's taking his knife. This would be the left side. This is the left side of a carcass. And so he's taking his knife on the inside of the leg, or the top, okay? And we use really technical phrases. Beef is really obvious with this. Beef top and bottom round is how we've set them on the table. So top round is inside. This is the inside of the ham as well for pork. And so the inside is where you start. These skins, Jerry, you might talk about where the skins are headed.
Well, right now, these skins would go to rendering.
Yep.
We do... Hormel does take a midsection skin, and that will actually go to two places. One is Wolverine to make hush puppies. The other is to go to the Eastern European countries where they make clothing out of it. So basically 19,000 a day in Austin and another 10,000 skins in Fremont, Nebraska would be going towards this.
Towards leather. Hide.
Yep.
Okay, so he's quickly gotten this skin off. As you can see, by weight, as you can imagine, this is a pretty high yield as well. So when you're talking about weight and where all your weight goes, this is a fair amount of weight as well. Not quite as much as in a beef carcass with the hair all over it, but again, also can be a food product. Pork skin is a food product as well, so that's certainly an option for that. We've got the de-skinned ham. Getting orientation, he's holding it where you can see the outside of the leg, and then the face, the cut face. That bone right there is where it was separated from the hip. So that's essentially the hip bone. And that's what he's got to go after first in order to get to the rest of the muscles, is to remove the hip bone. So again, the hip bone, the ball joint from the leg is sitting up into the hip bone. This is a socket joint sitting here, and that's got to come off first so that we can separate the regions of the ham. This one's tricky. If you ever hear an injury, an athlete tearing an ACL or things, it's all you're doing is going through ligaments here, so a little trickier. On a line and automation, oftentimes these hams will sort of be on a conveyor where they can pull down and just pull these off. People that do it every day, it'll take 5 seconds. Yep. Other things you're not going to see differences here. This is a demonstration, obviously, and in everyday processing, we're going to be using a lot more safety equipment. Here you can see the socket joint and that ligament that was holding the ball joint in it. Okay, so this has got to come out a piece of bone. But continuing on, as he's continuing to fabricate the inside and the knuckle, it's important to remember there would be a fair amount more safety equipment because these people are doing this on a shift every single day. So we're talking about arm guards, steel gloves, belly guards under your apron, lots of outerwear to make sure that nobody's getting injured. Especially with automation, you're talking about 19,000 a day. You might just be doing hip bones, but you're going to do many hip bones in your shift. So there's the tendency to get lax and maybe take some shortcuts.
You're working with sharp knives, moving parts, moving pieces, and so you're doing everything you can to provide the safety equipment, to provide the protection, the cover, because there is a good risk here using a knife.
So the first muscle grouping he took off would be your quadriceps, or the front, the quad. Okay, the muscles on the front of the leg. You can see this bone down here is the patella. That's the kneecap. So we're going down the front of the leg and taking the kneecap off with it, and that's that section there. This is the tip. Okay, the tip of the ham, or in beef we call it the ball, or the ball tip. The knuckle. Okay, and so this would be the first boneless portion of the ham once this patella is removed. This is when we start sorting the ham, and we'll talk about sorting the ham because when we ask people generally, what do we do with this ham, everybody will say, well, we cure it and we smoke it. And the reality is we don't do that. We don't leave that bone in there to do that most often. You can still find traditional hams with bone in them, sure, spiral cut. But more often than not, we're going to be making a boneless product. So with that happening, you've got such a large muscle here. There are so many muscles that have different colors. We actually sort the ham. And so we sort by color, not necessarily by location, but by color, so that when you get deli ham and you slice across it, it's all the same color pink. Even if this ham is a different pink than this ham, they're all the same color pink within the ham. So we don't have that marbled, mottled effect. So that's why we're taking this ham apart. So the knuckle came off, and then we've got the inside. This would be your gracilis, basically. This is a tougher muscle on the inside. Okay, he's gone down and found the flat, okay, would be the eye. In beef, we call it the eye of round. This is the eye of the ham. It's just smaller. Very uniform in directionality of this fiber. Okay, but again, a lighter color. True of beef as well. This muscle is always going to be a little lighter. It's a semitendinosus muscle, if you're curious. And so again, that's the necessity for sorting, is because we know that this semitend and even this gracilis are a good bit different in color. So these are going to get sorted differently. You sort to 4 colors or 5 or somewhere in that area. But again, generally also the inside of the ham, so this is the ham inside, generally is a little bit more tender than the outside, just as the animal functions. As you can imagine, on the outside the muscles are doing a little bit more work. So this is a more tender portion of the ham than the flat or the outside of the ham, which he's cleaning up now, which included the eye. And so again, a nice high-yielding portion, no bone, gets sorted, and this is where we start restructuring hams and going with boneless products. Jerry, thoughts?
A couple things here. So we are sorting based on color, but at the same time, a lot of the same muscle is sorted into the same color components, and a lot of it has to do too with the value of the ham. So the lower valued hams, there's less sorting. The higher valued hams, like the Cure 81 ham, there's a lot of sorting that'll go into you wanting to make sure. So we may have Cure 81s that have both. What do you call it? I'm calling it
Flats and insides?
Okay, so insides and outsides.
Yep.
Hormel, they're flanking cushions.
Flanks and cushions.
So a Cure 81 would have 2 of those, or it could have 2 of those, but it's not going to have 1 of those and 1 of those. You're getting similar type muscle structures into the same ham.
Looking for consistency. Again, consistency of eating experience is really key there. Going in for fun, just because this is a more trendy thing that's happening, is if you get into the bottom of the ham, down in that lower shank, that lower joint, this is commonly where we make trim. I mean, we're going to take that trim out, we're going to try to mechanically separate it or even knife it out, and that's going to be something that goes to the grinder. As we continue to try to add value, something that's gotten popular is pig wings. And so we were just going to, for fun, kind of run in here. Generally, you take there's 2 bones in the lower leg, and you're separating and taking the smaller of the bones, and you're leaving the flesh on it, very much like a chicken wing. And so it's meant to sort of compete with a chicken wing, the pig wing. I think they're fantastic. But again, each company is cutting these a little bit differently. Right now, if you can see the small bones in there, so we could actually just trim the back, and it would be very much like a drum, much bigger than a chicken drum. But again, that's the thinking there is it's a convenience food. Any thoughts on the lower shank? Yeah.
The only thing we might use that for it's not going into that or to trim, is we would use it in what's called shank cones that go in as filler or extender to help with the bind of some of our sliced ham products. You're putting more water in it, you're needing the bind, so you're going to put some more of this type of product into that ham.
Okay. So generally, as we've gotten through the carcass now, what we like to do is we're going to rebuild the carcass, so to speak, on some trays, sort all these cuts out. If you want to come chat with us, ask questions, that's also kind of what we're wanting to do, is get questions from you, thoughts, as we walk through this again. So this will be the end of the sort of large group activity, but you're more than welcome to come on up, come see us on campus, buy Hormel products, and we'll see you soon.